Imagine how awesome it would be to see a werewolf and a giant bear fight a pack of goblins, a witch using magic to tear apart a house, and a dragon blasting bouts of flame or fighting giant sharks. These are just some of the amazing scenes I get to bring to life on the covers I create for novels of the Demon Accords by John Conroe. About 8 years ago, I discovered a series of books I loved so much that I could binge them multiple times in a year without losing passion for the stories being told. On one such binge of the audiobooks, I felt compelled to create my version of Kirby, the shadow form of a godhawk that carries exorcised demons back to hell. Chuffed with the image, I shared it with the author, letting him know he could use it however he wished and just enjoying the idea of getting to contribute in some small way to this universe I loved so much. This interaction led me to the privileged position of being able to design the covers of my favourite book series for the last 6.5 years. With the recent release of Lucky Son of a Gun, the 19th mainline novel in the series, I thought it might be interesting for a behind-the-scenes look at how a Demon Accords cover gets made. It all starts with a brief from John, who describes a scene he would like to recreate. There might be a short back and forth where I highlight areas that might cause me trouble or that I don't think will work on a cover, and I will offer suggestions for alternatives. But this part of the process has always been painless, and it's not long before I get started. With Lucky Son of a Gun, the scene I was recreating was where Declan, maybe my favourite character in this series, uses magic to lift a Russian missile cruiser from the Mediterranean Sea, while surrounded by some of his closest friends on a holiday in France. With a solid idea of what this cover might look like, it's time to start bringing that idea to life. I knew from the brief that most of the cover will be photo-based, so my first step is to find useful images from photography websites. It might not sound like it, but this is the most time-intensive part of the process. Finding good assets as a base to work from makes the rest of what I do so much easier that it's worth spending the time to find what you need up front. I needed models with the same look as the 4 characters needed for the cover, each facing away from the camera and where the entire body was in shot. I imagine it's rare that people need photos of people's backs, so it's more difficult than it might sound to find the right pictures. Once I have them, it's a painless process to remove the background. This used to be more time intensive when I needed to trace around the characters manually, but thanks to Adobe's new AI-assisted tools, most of the work is done fast, and I just need to touch up some edges. For characters with lots of loose hair, I find it's easier and faster to use Photoshop's colour channels to select what I need. Duplicating the colour channel with the highest contrast between the subject and the background, boosting the levels to create more contrast, and painting in any of the larger areas the process missed, leaves you with a silhouette that can be selected and removed from the background. With the characters ready, I create a base artboard I will use for the cover and start arranging them in place. The reason for good starter images becomes clearer here. The model standing in for Declan was holding the right pose, but he wasn't tall enough to fit Declan's character, so I needed to grow him a little. I do this by extending his lower legs, upper legs and torso, and using a mixture of digital painting and the clone stamp tool to fill in the gaps. 3 smaller changes allow me to grow the character proportionally without the changes being obvious. Finally, I need to bulk him up just a touch. Declan is lean and tall, but I know his training has left him in good shape, so I wanted to add a little hint of muscle. Again, I don't want the changes to be too big or noticeable, but just enough that it fits the character. To create a background, I tried out Adobe's AI generative fill to get me started. But, as is often the limitation I find with that tool, you have to spend a lot of time crafting the perfect prompt if you're starting from a blank canvas. Here it was easier to go to stock photography and work forward from that. Obviously these characters aren't just going to be floating in mid-air, they are in fact standing on a veranda of the beautiful Chateau de Cassis. I guarantee I butchered the pronunciation of that. Sorry France. To make everything easier to line up, I created this in 3D modelling software using this image as a reference. I start with the floor, then I adjust to match the uneven edge of the reference photo, then extrude the edge to create a wall. I duplicated the top plane of that wall and deleted all the vertices, save those that would give me a single edge that followed the path of the wall. Converted the edge into a curve allowed me to use its geometry to create a cylindrical shape that would form a guardrail. With a few extra cylinders as supports, voila, the modelling of the wall was done. I applied a material that was similar to the stonework of the chateau and make adjustments so it fits the wall better. The night scene of this village was used for lighting, and a metal texture finished the structure. To align everything correctly with the cover, I overlaid a screenshot of the characters in the correct positions over a camera that was sized to the dimensions of the cover. I aligned the camera so the characters looked like they were standing at the wall looking out at the sea. After some set decoration and adjustments to the camera settings to add some depth of field, I rendered the image and brought it back into Photoshop. The veranda is in place, but right now everything looks like what it is, a lot of cut-out elements stuck together. To fix this, I start amending colours, doing my best to tie them all together and make them appear as part of the same image. Spending extra time to focus on the shadows and highlights on the characters helped ground them in the scene. It's about this point that I get a good feel for whether the cover is working, despite not having all the elements in place. There is enough here now that I can imagine what the cover will look like with everything finished, and I can see if any big changes are needed before continuing. One element that had me worried was the large amount of empty space. It felt like the cover was missing elements to draw the eye to the subject, so I added branches around the image to help frame the cover and guide the eye to what would eventually be the main focus. However, I still wasn't happy with my efforts and felt like I was at a dead end. At times like this, I find it's more useful to turn my attention to something completely different rather than dwelling on the problem, so I started on the main title. I leaned into the concept of luck for this title, choosing a vintage-looking font that felt like it belonged in the Wild West. I see this font and I feel like it would be right at home on a deck of cards, which I thought played into the theme of the title. I wasn't happy with the spacing of the font out of the box as it looked too generic and needed tweaking to make it work on the cover. However, even after doing this, I felt like the font still wasn't working. The issue lay with the 3D element of the text that might work for a poster with nothing around it, but it didn't fit well as the centerpiece of the cover. So I corrected the angle of the blockiness of this font in Adobe Illustrator until I felt like I had something that worked better on the cover. Finally, it was just a case of maneuvering it into place and creating some Photoshop effects to help it jump out at the viewer before moving on to the last element of the cover, the missile cruiser. I was unable to source an image of a Russian missile cruiser that I could legally use on a cover. However, I could luckily find a 3D model of the ship. This was actually a much better option as it would make getting the ship at the right angle and matching the lighting of the image that much easier. Again, I used a reference photo of the cover to this point in order to get the right angle for the ship before moving on to try and pick up some details that I felt were lacking in the model. However, I soon stopped myself as I realised I was going into far too much detail for something that would be too small to see on the cover. I instead turned my attention to amending the texture of the ship to look more lifelike. Mixing the metal texture in with the texture already on the model seemed to do the trick. The final steps of the process were to match the lighting of the 3D software to the lighting of the scene to make the ship easier to place on the cover. I also added in a plane to create the shadow under the ship, roughly where I felt the shadow would end up being on the sea. This ended up not being necessary, as shadows are easy enough to create in Photoshop. Thanks to the overlay placement in the camera of the 3D software, adding the rendered image to the cover was easy, so now all that remained with the ship was adding in some splashes to make it look like the ship had just been pulled from the ocean rather than just placed on the image. With the ship and title in place, I had to replace the moon with something that worked better with the image. Then I addressed the irritating negative space that still wasn't working for me by adding in some more elements to frame the scene. Still not happy, I moved on to more lighting work on the characters to see if that could draw the eye and solve the problem, but soon went back to working on the framing of the image and the colour grading. Despite this effort, I still wasn't confident with the framing of this one, so I tried adding flaming edges as though the image was on singed paper. These were simply created by using glowing layer effects and then hand painting them in. Finally, I was happy with the first draft and I submitted it to John for feedback. One of the most nerve-wracking points in every cover design is receiving feedback on the first draft. It's here where you find out if what you've created is headed in the right direction or if you've completely missed the mark and have to start over. While it happens occasionally, it is very rare that a designer will get it perfect on the first try. Luckily, it's almost as rare that you completely crash and burn. In this case, the feedback was that in general, the cover was moving in the right direction, but there were several elements that needed to be changed. The first thing to go were the flaming edges. Having had a few days away from the design by this point, I couldn't agree with this change more. These edges were the answer to an issue that had been troubling me throughout the design, and my frustration had led to a solution that was over the top and made the image look needlessly cluttered. The second change was one that I worried about a little more. John requested the tables be removed from the veranda, which I felt at the time might leave the foreground with a large empty void that needed to be filled. I left that for now to worry about later as I moved on to the next change, which was the Stacia character. The model was a little too slender to meet the description of Stacia. I tried to fix this in Photoshop at first, but I gave up on that idea early when I realised that this was going to look fake pretty fast. Instead, I opted for a new model to replace her, one that was a little more fitting with the character. The next change was a simple one thanks to the 3D model of the ship. I changed the angle to match what John had in mind for this scene. This was another worry at first, as I thought the new angle would break the illusion of reality in the scene, as the ship now had no connection with the water and would look obviously photoshopped in place. However, once I added in some more splashes and shadows, I think this actually ended up working better than the earlier version. Finally, I dealt with the empty space below the characters by simply updating the lighting and amending the titles to fill the void. This had the knock-on effect of fixing the issue that had plagued me throughout this process, the awkward framing of the image. The issue had been that the image was unbalanced, with a lot going on in the frame's foreground, but not much going on up top in the ocean. Balancing the image made that empty space work better and had the cover looking much more finished. The final edit was to change the title. While the Western font promoted the theme of luck, John pointed out that this sort of luck was not how Max Sutton's luck worked. His luck focused on life or death situations, and the luck of cards and gambling wasn't applicable here. John was keen to move back to familiar titles, to others I created for earlier entries in the Demon Accords, and in hindsight I should have stuck with that anyway. Sometimes it's easy for designers to get caught up in an idea and forget about the bigger picture, that being that these covers are part of a series, and whilst each one needs to be unique to each book, they need to share a design language that ties them together. I started with a more appropriate font and then manipulated that title to look more appealing. My favourite way of doing this is to create a hierarchy within the title by picking out the most important words and making them significantly larger than the rest of the title. Then I like to arrange the rest of the title so that I can eliminate any uncomfortable spaces. In this case, that involved creating overlapping characters, which I think helps the title stand out a little more than simply using a fancy font. Finally, it's ready to import into Photoshop and make it fit with the cover, then make some quick adjustments to make it stand out before the second draft is ready for approval. This draft worked much better for John, and the cover was ready to be turned into multiple formats ready for the book's release. So, there we have it. This was the process that creates a cover for a novel in the Demon Accords, taking us from concept through to finished artwork. The process for most of these covers have been similar, with only the ones requiring custom illustrations adding in a few extra steps. As with all the covers in this series, Lucky Son of a Gun has been a lot of fun to work on, and having finished reading the book before finishing this video, I can attest that it was even more fun to read. So if you haven't read it yet, then please don't hesitate, there's a link in the description of this video for where you can buy it. If by some chance you haven't read any of the Demon Accords series, then I'm jealous because you get to binge the series right from the start. I might not have worked on the early covers in the series, but don't hold that against them. This became one of my favourite series for an excellent reason, and I can't recommend it highly enough. There are links to the entire series in the description below, so go back to Godtouched and get started on these amazing books. You won't regret it. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like over on YouTube and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos about the creative process, covering topics from design, illustration and web development right through to topics like novel writing, editing and self-publishing. I also have captured video of the cover creation process for Black Frost, Blood Drawn and the third Demon Accords compendium, so let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing how those are made and maybe we can make that happen as well. For now though, thanks for watching and hopefully I'll see you soon.